October 9th, 1942. The sky is a brilliant, unforgiving blue. 20,000 feet above a sweltering green hell on earth, an island called Guadalcanal. Up here in the thin, cold air, a 22-year-old American pilot named Marion Carl is fighting for his life. Every instinct is screaming. His heart is a drum against his ribs. He is no longer a pilot, he is prey. He's wrestling the controls of a Grumman F4F Wildcat. It's a stubby, heavy, carrier-based fighter. It's tough, it's reliable, and right now it feels like a flying brick. Because he is being hunted. His enemy is a ghost, a whisper in the sky, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. This plane, it's not just an aircraft, it's an apparition. It's so light, so impossibly agile, it feels like it's flown back in time from the future. It can turn inside the Wildcat's radius not once, but twice over. It can climb like a rocket strapped to a whisper. For the past year, from the fiery ruins of Pearl Harbor to the fall of the Philippines, the Zero has been a phantom that owned the Pacific skies. It moved with a grace that American pilots simply couldn't comprehend. Marion Carl is an ace, a damn good pilot. But at this moment, staring at the sun-glinted canopy of the Zero glued to his six, he is just meat. The Zero is there, unshakable. Carl shoves the stick forward, pushing his Wildcat into a desperate, screaming dive. The heavy American plane builds speed, the wind shrieking past the cockpit. But it's not enough. The Zero stays with him, a predator locked onto its victim. He rolls hard right. The Wildcat responds, but it's slow, sluggish. Like the P-38, it feels mushy, like trying to turn in thick mud. The Zero is already there. It anticipated his move before he even made it. From the Zero's wings, little lights start to wink. Not angry flashes, just methodical, deadly winks. Carl's cockpit doesn't just get hit, it explodes. A storm of metal shreds the air around him. Shrapnel tears through his leg, hot and searing. The instrument panel shatters. His controls go dead, limp in his hands. He's no longer flying, he's just falling. He's going down. Somehow, through the shock and the pain, he manages to bail out. He throws himself from the dying plane and into the empty blue, his parachute snapping open just in time. He lands in the warm, shark-infested waters below, saved only by a miracle, a tiny speck of life in a vast, indifferent ocean. This was the brutal reality of the air war in the Pacific.
This was Guadalcanal. But just weeks later, another farm boy, this one from the frozen plains of South Dakota, would climb into that same deadly sky, and he would change everything. It wasn't a war. For the American pilots on Guadalcanal, it was a meat grinder. It was a place where young men, barely out of their teens, were being fed one by one into the razor-sharp teeth of the Japanese war machine. The American press, trying to find a heroic angle, called the pilots stationed there the Cactus Air Force. The pilots themselves, the ones living and dying there, had a different name for their base. They called Henderson Field the Graveyard. The problem wasn't just the Zero, it was something far more insidious. It was the doctrine, the rule book. Back in the safety of America, the brilliant engineers, the seasoned strategists, they had looked at the schematics, crunched the numbers, and delivered a simple, clean, logical solution. A commandment, really. It was hammered into every pilot: never turn with a Zero. It sounded smart. It sounded safe. It was the same advice given to the pilots of the P-38 Lightning. Use your strengths. The American planes were heavy, they were tough, they had armor. So the doctrine was simple. Use your speed, use your weight, dive, take a shot, and then run. Get out of there. Live to fight another day. But in the chaotic, swirling, three-dimensional dogfights over Guadalcanal, that doctrine was getting men killed. Every single day. Because the Japanese pilots weren't rookies, they were hardened veterans. They had honed their skills over the vast landscapes of China. They had perfected their tactics over Pearl Harbor. They knew their aircraft not as machines, but as extensions of their own bodies. They knew the American doctrine better than the Americans did. They exploited it. They dangled in front of the American pilots, baiting them, daring them into turns. They knew the Wildcat was slow to respond. They knew its weaknesses, its blind spots. They knew exactly where to place their cannon shells to tear it apart. The Americans were losing, desperately. What the exhausted men of the Cactus Air Force didn't know, what the veteran Japanese pilots, flush with victory, couldn't possibly imagine, was that the solution to their problem was on its way. But it wasn't a new super-advanced plane. It wasn't a revised doctrine sent down from Washington. It was a 27-year-old farmer.
A man so unassuming, he had been officially told he was too old to fly in combat. A man who had learned the art of shooting not from a military manual, but by hunting jackrabbits on the frozen, windswept plains of South Dakota. This is the story of Joseph J. Foss, and the simple, forgotten farmer's trick that would make him America's ace of aces. To understand how a single farmer could terrorize the entire Japanese Air Force, you first have to understand the farm. Joe Foss was not a career soldier. He wasn't born into a military family. He was born in 1915 on a remote, unelectrified farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood wasn't spent in neat classrooms or playing games in the street. It was spent in the dirt, in the biting cold, in the relentless howling wind. This was a classic David versus Goliath story, just like that of Simo Häyhä. But for Foss, Goliath wasn't just the enemy, it was life itself. The Great Depression hit South Dakota like an artillery barrage. The land, once fertile, dried up and turned to dust. The crops failed. The family had nothing. Foss's character, that stubborn Finnish grit the Finns call sisu, wasn't a choice. It was forged from pure necessity. To eat, you had to be tougher than the world around you. He and his father would hunt, not for sport, but to put food on the table. And this is where the secret modification begins. When a 12-year-old Joe Foss hunted jackrabbits, he didn't have a fancy rifle with a scope. He had an old, worn shotgun, and one simple rule from his father: don't waste shells. Shells cost money, and money was something they didn't have. Every shot had to count. Now, a jackrabbit doesn't run in a straight line. It's a creature of pure chaos. It weaves, it darts, it reverses direction in a heartbeat. To hit it, you couldn't aim at it. That was a guaranteed miss. You had to aim where it was going to be. It's a principle called deflection shooting, leading your target. While other kids his age were learning arithmetic from a textbook, Joe Foss was performing complex ballistic calculations in his head in a fraction of a second. Lead, windage, speed, trajectory. He wasn't just a good shot, he became a predator. He developed an intuitive, instinctual understanding of the science of hitting a moving target. This was his iron sight. This was his piano wire. It was a farmer's eye, a hunter's instinct that no military manual on earth could ever teach.
But Foss didn't want to hunt rabbits forever. He wanted to fly. In 1933, his father took him to a local air show. He saw a Marine Corps squadron of biplanes roaring through the sky in perfect formation. He was 18 years old, and in that moment, he was completely and utterly hooked. He turned to his father and said, "That's what I'm going to do." The path seemed impossible. He was a poor farm kid with no formal education beyond the basics. Then tragedy struck. His father was killed in a horrific accident, electrocuted by a downed power line. At just 19 years old, Joe had to drop out of school to take over and run the family farm. He was trapped, but he had that sisu. He worked the farm by day, and at night he took classes. It took him 6 long years just to get enough credits to enter college. He paid his way through by washing dishes, saving every penny he could to earn a pilot's license. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Joe Foss was 26 years old. He raced to enlist, to finally become the pilot he dreamed of being. He went to the Navy. They rejected him. He was too old. In 1941, the cutoff age for a new fighter pilot was 25. They looked at this determined man from the plains and told him he could be a flight instructor, teach the younger kids how to fly. It was a devastating blow. It was the engineering officer telling McKenna the cables were within spec. It was the experts telling Simo Haiha to use a scope. The doctrine, the official rulebook, said he was unfit for combat. So Foss did what all our heroes do. He broke the rules. He found a loophole. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve, became an instructor, and for 9 long, agonizing months, he watched as the 20-year-old kids he had trained were sent off to war, while he stayed behind. Foss was enraged. He became a nuisance. He hounded his superiors. He demanded a combat assignment. He wrote letters. He made noise. He was, in his own words, the loudest, most annoying instructor in the Navy. Finally, just to shut him up, they gave in. They sent him to advanced fighter training. He was assigned to a new squadron, VMF 121. And in October 1942, at the exact same time Marion Carl was being shot out of the sky, 27-year-old Grandpa Joe Foss, the too-old farmer from South Dakota, was finally put on a transport ship. His destination? Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The place he arrived at was not a military base. It was hell on earth. The moment he stepped off the plane, the smell hit him. A thick, humid, suffocating mix of engine oil, rotting jungle vegetation, and the unmistakable, sweet, sickly stench of death. The runway wasn't paved. It was a pockmarked strip of dirt and crushed coral carved hastily out of the palm trees. The operations center, the nerve center of the entire air war, was a rickety wooden shack they called the Pagoda. The pilots' quarters were mud-floored tents. And everywhere were the wrecks. Dozens of F4F Wildcats and P-39 Airacobras shoved to the side of the runway like broken toys. Their wings were torn off, their engines shattered, their cockpits stained dark. This was the graveyard of the Cactus Air Force, and the evidence was all around him. Foss was assigned to his tent. He met the men he would be flying with. They weren't the fresh-faced, eager kids he had trained back in the States. They were ghosts. Their faces were a sickly yellow from Adabrine, the anti-malaria drug. Their eyes were bloodshot and hollow from lack of sleep, from the constant stress of combat and nightly Japanese bombardments. Their flight suits were permanently stained with sweat and grease. They were veterans, yes, but they were also the hunted. And into this grim scene walks Joe Foss, the old man, the farmer. They looked at him, sized him up. He was new meat, another body to replace the one they lost yesterday. Foss walked over to his assigned plane, a Grumman F4F Wildcat, the exact same type of plane Marion Carl had been shot down in. It was heavy, it was slow, it was, by all accounts, a flying coffin when put up against the Mitsubishi Zero. The squadron's executive officer, a man named Duke, gave Foss the standard briefing, the same one that was getting them all killed. Never turn with a Zero, never, dive and run. Joe Foss listened. He nodded. He understood the words, but he also understood something the doctrine had completely missed. He understood jackrabbits. The next morning, Foss would fly his first mission. He was heading straight into the kill zone. He was a farmer in a flying coffin, about to fight the most advanced fighter plane on Earth. And he was about to use a trick that wasn't written in any manual. Joe Foss's first flight over Guadalcanal was not a gentle training run. It was a trial by fire. He climbed to 15,000 feet, his eyes straining, scanning the vast empty blue. The ghosts back in his squadron had warned him. They come out of the sun. You never see them until they're shooting at you. Foss was leading his first patrol, and he felt completely, utterly blind. Then the radio crackled to life. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Foss snapped his head up and to the left. He saw them, a formation of Mitsubishi Zeros diving out of the sun, just like they said. They were fast, faster and more graceful than anything he had ever seen in his life. He remembered his orders, the doctrine, never turn, dive and run. Foss shoved his stick forward, putting his Wildcat into a screaming dive. His heavy plane accelerated, the G-forces pushing him down into his seat. The Zeros followed, effortlessly. One of them opened fire.
Bright tracer rounds zipped past Foss's canopy, so close he instinctively flinched. He kept diving, pushing his plane all the way down to the jungle canopy, weaving through the treetops until he finally shook the Zeros off his tail. He returned to Henderson Field, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, hard anger. The doctrine was wrong. He knew it in his bones. You couldn't win a war by constantly running away. You could only survive. And Joe Foss hadn't come all this way to just survive. He had come here to hunt. On October 13th, just a few days after his arrival, Foss was leading another patrol. This time, they ran headlong into a group of Japanese bombers protected by a screen of Zeros. The dogfight erupted instantly. It was chaos. Wildcats and Zeros twisting and turning in a deadly aerial ballet. Foss saw a Zero lock onto his wingman's tail. The Japanese pilot was closing in, methodical, precise, getting ready for the kill. The doctrine said Foss should dive away, run, find an easier target, or live to fight another day. The farmer's eye said something different. Foss rolled his Wildcat hard. He ignored the Zero on his wingman's tail. He wasn't aiming at the enemy plane. He was aiming where the jackrabbit was going to be. He pulled the trigger. His 650 caliber machine guns roared to life, a sound like tearing canvas. He fired a long, deliberate 3-second burst, not at the enemy plane, but at a patch of empty blue sky 200 feet in front of it. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a rookie mistake, a panicked, wasted shot. But the Japanese pilot, totally focused on his own kill, didn't see Foss. He executed a perfect tight turn to line up his shot and flew directly into the stream of 50 caliber rounds. The Zero's wing didn't just get damaged, it simply came off. The plane vanished in a sudden, violent cloud of metal and fire. It was Foss's first kill. He hadn't outturned the Zero, he hadn't outrun it, he had outthought it. He had used the farmer's logic that the experts back in Washington had completely forgotten. He landed back at Henderson Field a different man. The ghosts, the weary veterans gathered around him. He had his first kill. He slapped the side of his Wildcat and told his crew chief, "This plane, it's a truck, but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." He turned to his fellow pilots, the men who had been watching their friends die for weeks. "Forget what they told you," he said. "Don't chase them. Lead them. Lead them until you think you're going to miss. Then lead them some more. They will fly right into it." This was his piano wire modification. This was his iron sight logic. It wasn't a physical change to the plane. It was a mental one. It was a mental one, a hunter's confidence replacing a victim's fear. The pilots listened. They were desperate. Their former ace, Marion Carl, was still recovering from his wounds. They needed a leader. And this 27-year-old farmer was the only one talking about hunting, not running. Foss took informal command of his flight of 8 Wildcats. They were a band of misfits, a mix of cast-offs and new arrivals. They didn't have a cool official nickname, so the press, watching this old man lead his chaotic, aggressive squadron, gave them one. They called them Foss's Flying Circus. And on October 16th, the circus went to work. Foss led his 8 planes straight into a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft. 32 to 8. On paper, it was suicide. But Foss had a plan. He wasn't going to get into a turning dogfight. He was going to use his farmer's logic on a grand scale. He ordered his flight to use the Thach Weave, a new tactic where 2 planes flew in pairs, weaving back and forth, covering each other's vulnerable tails. Foss dove in. He saw a Zero. He didn't turn to follow it. He pulled lead. He fired. The Zero exploded. Another Zero dove on him from behind, but Foss's wingman, weaving with him, saw it coming. The wingman rolled over and shot the Zero clean off Foss's tail. The Circus was a well-oiled machine. In 10 minutes of brutal, swirling combat, Foss's flight of 8 shot down 5 Japanese planes. Foss himself got 2. The Circus returned to base, with all 8 of their planes intact. The graveyard was suddenly winning. And then the numbers started to climb.
They climbed at a rate that nobody, not the Americans, not the Japanese, could possibly believe. It was Simo Haha's kill count all over again. October 18th, Foss shoots down 2 more. October 20th, he downs another. By October 23rd, just 10 days after his very first kill, Joe Foss was officially an ace with 5 victories. October 25th, he shoots down 3 zeros in a single day. The old man, the farmer, the guy they said was unfit for combat, was now the deadliest pilot on the island. He wasn't just a pilot anymore, he was a leader. His flying circus was dominating the sky. But just like with Simo Haha, this kind of impossible success comes at a cost. The Japanese were now furious. They were losing planes at an unsustainable rate. Their veteran pilots, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience, were being shot down by inferior Wildcats. It didn't make any sense. And the one name they kept hearing in their radio intercepts, the name that started to haunt their debriefings, was Foss. The Japanese high command began to notice, just like Stavka had noticed Simo, just like Saburo Sakai had noticed the P-38s. The enemy was adapting. They weren't just fighting Wildcats anymore. They were hunting Foss's flying circus. The war for Joe Foss became personal. On November 7th, Foss was leading his flight when they were jumped by an elite group of Japanese aces sent specifically to take him down. The sky was filled with planes. Foss, in the thick of it, shot down 2 zeros. He was lining up a third when his plane was ripped apart by cannon fire from behind. His engine exploded, his cockpit filled with thick black smoke. He was going down again. He managed to bail out, his plane crashing into the dense jungle below. He was rescued, shaken, but miraculously unharmed. Just 2 days later, he was back in the air. This time, he was chasing a Japanese float plane, a Jake. He was so focused on the kill, so intent on the hunt, that he didn't see the Jake's rear gunner. The gunner opened fire. The bullets shattered Foss's engine. For the second time in 3 days, his plane was dead in the air. But this time, he wasn't over the jungle. He was over the open ocean. He ditched his Wildcat in the water. The plane hit the waves hard and sank in less than 30 seconds. Foss was alone. Floating in the middle of the Pacific, 10 miles from land, he was in the Slot, one of the most shark-infested stretches of water on Earth. He floated in his life vest as the sun began to set, the water turning cold. He had that sisu. He was a farmer. He was used to waiting. He was used to surviving. But then he saw them, fins, dozens of them, slicing through the water. Sharks. They began to circle him. They bumped him, testing him. Foss, the man who hunted zeros in the sky, was now being hunted by something far older, far more primal. He treaded water. He waited. He watched the fins get closer and closer. He had no weapon, no radio, just his farmer's grit. For 4 hours he floated, surrounded. Just as the sun was setting, a canoe appeared on the horizon. It was manned by native islanders, sent by an Australian coast watcher who had, by sheer dumb luck, seen the plane go down. They paddled toward him, beating the water with their oars to scare the sharks away. They dragged the exhausted, hypothermic pilot from the water. When they got him back to Henderson Field, he was a wreck. He was suffering from exposure, and worse, he had contracted malaria. The doctors ordered him grounded. Joe Foss, the ace of aces, was put in a hospital bed. His flying circus had to fly without him. The Japanese, hearing he was gone, believed he was dead. The ghost of Guadalcanal was finally gone. They were wrong. Joe Foss lay in that hospital bed for 2 weeks, shaking with fever, his body racked with chills, thinking about only one thing. The jackrabbits were getting away. He recovered. He walked out of the hospital, climbed back into a new Wildcat, and on November 30th, he went hunting again. He shot down another zero. The ghost was back, and he was angry. The Japanese threw everything they had at him. He kept coming. By January 15, 1943, Joe Foss's tally stood at 23. He was just 3 kills away from tying the all-time American record, a record set in World War I by the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker's record was 26 kills. It was a holy number in American aviation, a number no pilot had ever touched. And now, a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota in a flying coffin was about to break it. By January 1943, the name Joe Foss was a legend on Guadalcanal, but it was a legend written in exhaustion and fever. The too-old farmer, now 27, was a physical wreck. The malaria he had contracted in the ocean had returned with a vengeance.
He was flying with a constant, raging fever. His ground crew would watch him land, his Wildcat riddled with fresh bullet holes, and he would be shaking so violently from the chills that they would have to lift him, drenched in sweat, from the cockpit. He was fighting two wars simultaneously, one in the sky against the Japanese and one in his own bloodstream against the malaria parasite, and he was winning both. His tally stood at 23. The all-time American record set by the legendary World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker was 26. That number, 26, was more than just a statistic. It was a mountain. It was the symbol of ultimate American victory in the air. For 2 decades, no pilot had even come close. And now, a half-delirious farm boy from South Dakota, flying a plane that was supposedly a death trap, was about to climb that mountain. January 15th, 1943. This was the day. Foss was sick, sicker than he'd ever been. The flight surgeon had strictly forbidden him from flying. He ignored him. He pulled himself into his cockpit, his head pounding, his vision swimming. The word was out. A massive Tokyo Express, a huge Japanese naval convoy, was steaming towards the island, protected by a massive screen of fighters. Foss and his flying Circus were sent up to intercept. The sky turned black with planes. It was the largest air battle Foss had ever seen. Zeros and Wildcats mixed in a chaotic, swirling melee. Foss, his vision blurred by fever, fell back on pure instinct. He fell back on the farm. He saw a Zero locking onto a wingman. He didn't think. He reacted. He rolled his Wildcat not at the Zero, but at the empty space where the jackrabbit was going to be. He fired. His .50 calibers ripped through the empty air. The Zero, committing to its turn, flew directly into the wall of lead. The plane disintegrated. That was kill number 24. He scanned the chaos of the battle. Another Zero was diving on a different group of Wildcats. Foss shoved his throttle to the firewall, his engines screaming in protest. He cut the Zero off. The Japanese pilot, seeing Foss, tried to outturn him, the classic Zero tactic. Foss didn't take the bait. He performed a high side pass, a maneuver he had perfected. He rolled over the top of the Zero, came down from its blind spot, and fired a single, perfect burst. The Zero's engine exploded. That was kill number 25. He had tied Rickenbacker. He was now, officially, a living legend. But he wasn't done. He saw another Japanese plane, a roof float plane fighter, trying to escape the battle. Foss dove after it. The roof pilot saw him coming and pulled into a desperate climbing turn. This was the ultimate test. The farmer's eye versus the veteran Japanese pilot. Foss didn't just follow, he calculated. He saw the roof's line of escape. He pushed his own plane's nose up, firing a long, arcing deflection shot that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The .50 caliber rounds traveled in a perfect, invisible line, meeting the exact point in the sky where the roof was trying to flee. The plane was hit directly in the cockpit. It fell from the sky, tumbling end over end into the Pacific. That was kill number 26. In a single afternoon, while shaking violently with malaria, Joe Foss had shot down 3 enemy planes. He had tied and then broken the unbeatable record. He landed his Wildcat at Henderson Field. The entire base was there waiting for him. The graveyard had become a field of victory. The ghosts of the Cactus Air Force lifted their too-old farmer out of his cockpit and carried him on their shoulders. He was, without question, America's ace of aces. But what the pilots on Guadalcanal celebrated, the Japanese high command in Rabaul mourned. This is the Saburo Sakai moment. This is the enemy's reaction.
For months, Japanese pilots had operated with supreme, unshakable confidence. They were flying the A6M Zero, a marvel of engineering. They were veterans. They knew the F4F Wildcat was inferior. They had killed dozens of them. Their doctrine was simple and effective. Force the Wildcat into a turn, get on at 6 o'clock, and kill it. Then Foss's flying Circus appeared, and suddenly the doctrine stopped working. Veteran Japanese pilots would return to their carriers, their faces pale, their hands shaking. They told their intelligence officers stories that made no sense. They said they would dive on a Wildcat, expecting it to run, but it wouldn't. They said they would bait it into a turn, but it wouldn't follow. Instead, the American plane would do something strange. It would roll or climb or dive, seemingly at random, fire its guns at empty sky, and then, a second later, the Zero next to them would explode. They couldn't understand what was happening. They were being hunted by a farmer's logic they couldn't possibly comprehend. Joe Foss had done exactly what Simo Häyhä had done. He had taken away the enemy's every advantage. Simo made himself invisible by hiding the glint of his scope and the steam of his breath. Foss made his intentions invisible by never aiming directly at his target. The Japanese pilots were fighting a ghost. They were fighting an invisible modification that wasn't made of piano wire or iron sights. It was forged in the brain of a South Dakota hunter. Foss had single-handedly broken their confidence. He had proven that the Zero was not, in fact, invincible. He had proven that the inferior Wildcat, in the hands of a pilot who understood the science of the jackrabbit, was the deadliest weapon in the sky. The Japanese aces who used to hunt Wildcats for sport were now hesitant. They were cautious. The Cactus Air Force was no longer the hunted. It was the hunter. And it all came down to one man who had been told he was too old to fight. But this victory came at a terrible price. This is the cost. This is the explosive bullet that Simo Häyhä faced. Foss's cost wasn't a single bullet. It was a slow, agonizing burnout. Days after breaking the record, Foss was grounded for good. The malaria had finally won. He was now so sick he could barely stand. He was suffering from recurring, debilitating fevers. He had lost over 30 pounds. The man who had faced down Zeros and sharks was being eaten alive from the inside. He didn't leave Guadalcanal in a victory parade. He was evacuated on a stretcher. A skeletal, yellow-skinned ghost, his body broken by the very island he had helped to save. He was flown to hospitals in the Pacific and then back to the United States. He was a national hero, but he was also an invalid. But Joe Foss had that sisu, that farmer's grit. He spent months in a naval hospital in San Diego, slowly recovering. And it was there that the nation he had served finally recognized him. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss, the farmer from South Dakota, stood in the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, around his neck. The citation praised his dauntless courage and his incomparable combat skill. But what was his true legacy? What was the ripple effect of his farmer's logic? It was hope. In late 1942, America was losing the war in the Pacific. The Zero was a mythic monster. The Japanese military was seen as an unstoppable force. Joe Foss, with his 26 kills in just 44 days, shattered that myth. He proved that an American farm boy in an American plane could beat the very best the enemy had. He didn't just write a new chapter in air combat, he wrote the entire manual on how to defeat the Zero. The deflection shooting and Thach Weave tactics he perfected became the new doctrine for the entire Pacific Fleet. He had saved Guadalcanal, and in doing so, he had helped turn the tide of the entire war. And what happens to a man who becomes the ace of aces when the war is over? Unlike Sergeant McKenna, whose modification remained a secret for decades, Foss's heroism was celebrated. But like Simo Häyhä, the farmer, he never forgot where he came from. He didn't stay in the military. He went home, to South Dakota. He used his fame not for himself, but for his people. He entered politics. He was elected to the South Dakota legislature. And in 1954, that same farmer who had been told he wasn't good enough, who was too old to fight, was elected governor of South Dakota.
He served his state with the same tenacity he had served his country. He later went on to become the first commissioner of the American Football League and a beloved national figure. But he was always, at his core, that man from the farm, the man who understood the simple, brutal logic of the hunt. That's how wars are truly won, not by the experts or the engineers who read from a manual, but by the individuals on the ground, or in the air, who see the flaw in the system. James McKenna, the mechanic, saw a flaw in a P-38's control cable. He saw a 3 to 8 inch slack that meant death, and he fixed it with a 6-inch piece of piano wire. Simo Heha, the farmer, saw a flaw in the sniper doctrine. He saw that a high-tech scope glinted in the sun, and he fixed it by using his old, reliable iron sights. And Joe Foss, the farm boy, saw a flaw in his supposedly inferior plane. He saw that you couldn't outturn a Zero, but you could outthink it. And he fixed it not with a tool, but with the farmer's eye he had trained his entire life to use. These are the forgotten pages of history, the stories of the men who broke the rules to win the war. Joe Foss died in 2003 at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors, a hero to his nation, a legend to the Marine Corps, and a testament to the unbeatable sisu of the American farmer. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video.
It helps us share more of these forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.